Hello everyone, and welcome to today's episode on Songs of the Great Lakes. On today's episode I'll be covering 3 stories in one video. Now what makes this different than my normal videos is the fact of the matter that these vessels, at least to me, are literally unknown. Now a lot of times when I'm going throughout my research, looking in my glossary, just trying to gather as much information as I can beforehand, I come across a lot of vessels that there just quite simply is very little to no information on these ships, and heck, it's even a miracle if there exists a photo or two, even if there is out there of these ships. But a lot of times when I'm doing my research, I come across these ships in my glossary, and the records are just, they're spotty at best. You know, a lot of times the information is delegated to newspaper articles from back in the day when these accidents happened, when these sinkings occurred, and I started having my conscience bother me that I would begin to start passing up a lot of these ships because just a lack of information that was available on them. Well, that's not right, and I do not want these 3 forgotten ships, at least to me, in my opinion, to remain as such. Now, a final note to my more hardcore ship vessel nerds who probably know a lot more than I do many times on these vessels. Maybe you know of these 3 already, and you know more information about them as well, but I certainly did not know at all about them. And because of a lack of information about them, they definitely, especially because of the lives that were lost on them, deserve to be told today. So I do welcome any and all additional information or correction for today's vessels. So, without further ado, let's dive into today's episode in the 3 forgotten ships. On Wednesday, June 25th, 1890, the C.B. Lockwood was launched from the upper yard of Thomas Quilley's Sons, shipbuilders in Cleveland, Ohio. This ship was built for B.L. Pennington and other owners. The ship number 141 was christened as C.B. Lockwood. At the time, the Lockwood was stated as the largest wooden boat ever built in Cleveland. She was nearly 300 feet long, and she had a beam of 45 feet. She also had a hull depth of 21 feet. The Lockwood was built for bulk cargo carrying, and she had a rated capacity of 2,323 tons. The Lockwood actually collided and sank with the schooner Elizabeth A. Nicholson in the Detroit River off Amsterdam, Ontario. She was later raised and repaired and returned to service in 1894. Her fateful voyage was on October 13th of 1902. The Lockwood was downbound from Duluth, Minnesota to Buffalo, New York. She was carrying a cargo of around 100,000 bushels of flaxseed and wheat. As she had departed, a horrible November storm began to develop. This was on Lake Erie. The Lockwood put up a good fight as she was traveling down the length of Lake Erie. At around 4 p.m., about 15 miles west of Ashtabula, Ohio, the engineer of the Lockwood, named Burns, reported to her captain that he was not getting enough steam and suspected a line pipe may have burst in the storm. Captain Saff ordered that the Lockwood be anchored, and steam was let off its boilers. However, the repairs were not successful, and without steam to run the pumps in the Lockwood, the ship was at the mercy of the storm. The engineer then reported that water was filling the vessel, and Captain Saff told all members of the crew to prepare to abandon ship and head into the lifeboats. At 6:40 p.m., 2 lifeboats were lowered into the lake, and at around 7:15 p.m., the ship had been observed to be sinking. 9 people, including Captain Saff and his wife, left the ship in a 13-person life raft. The remaining crew members, including the engineer named Burns, with 9 others, left in a much larger and better equipped 20-person steel life raft. The survivors in the smaller life raft recounted a harrowing night which was spent on Lake Erie in the terrible storm. They were thrown about by the waves, and every wave seemed to be the last one that the boat could handle. One person was thrown from the life raft, but they were brought back on. There was only one oar left in the boat, and a shawl from one of the women was used as a sail. Finally, after battling for over 10 hours in heavy seas and rains, the crew in the smaller life raft was rescued by the steamer J.G. Grammer, about 1 mile off of Ashtabula, Ohio. The steel life raft, however, was missing, and so was the crew. Captain Saff waited in Ashtabula, hoping and praying to hear word of his crew's rescue. However, 4 days later, the empty lifeboat was found, floating upside down just a mile off of Ashtabula by the G.J. Grammer, and the crew was nowhere to be found. The engineer Burns and the 9 other crew members were lost. The SS John B. Lyon was a wooden bulk freighter steamer that weighed 1,710 tons. She was 250 feet long, and she was built in 1881. The Lyon could carry over 80,000 tons of iron ore. She was a cargo steamer. On September 12th of 1900, during the Great Storm of 1900, the Lyon was out on Lake Erie. The Great Storm of 1900 was a hurricane that hit Galveston, Texas. This storm was one of the largest hurricanes ever recorded and nearly flattened the Gulf port of Galveston, Texas. It also took over 6,000 lives in its devastation. When this hurricane made its way and finally hit Lake Erie and the Great Lakes area, it smashed into the John B. Lyon. The Lyon was lost, and she was carrying over 80,000 tons of iron ore in this hurricane. The Lyon was declared a total loss, and 9 crew members went down with her. However, there were 7 people who did survive her wreck. I do not believe her wreck has ever been located, and she is still lost and a mystery in Lake Erie. The J.D. Marshall was a wooden bulk freighter steam barge. She was over 154 feet in length, and she hauled lumber for over 20 years of her service. On the night of June 10, 1911, just off of Michigan City, Indiana, the J.D. Marshall's hull began to leak. Crew members went down below to patch the leak. The Marshall remained anchored for the duration of the night. However, in the early morning hours of June 11th, a terrible storm began to develop. The newly fixed area below began to leak, and the crewmen again went below to fix it. As the storm grew in intensity, waves began to smash into the Marshall, causing her to capsize. At the time, the Marshall was carrying in her holds full iron pigs. These were unrefined ingots. Her cargo began to shift, which added to her capsizing. 3 crew members were trapped below deck and drowned. 7 others jumped or were thrown into the water from the intensity of the storm. 5 of them made their way aboard the overturned ship and waited to be rescued. The captain made it to shore, thankfully. However, the first mate was one of the few that did not survive. I have found conflicting reports that it may have actually been 4 crew members who were lost. The J.D. Marshall now rests at the beach at the Indiana Dunes State Park. Most people that visit the state park are unaware of the tragic events that befell the J.D. Marshall. She now rests in about 30 feet of water. The J.D. Marshall laid at the bottom until the 1980s, when a group of salvagers were caught by the Coast Guard as they were attempting to try and raise the ship and salvage her. Sadly, the Marshall did lose some pieces due to the salvagers causing the curve of the hull to flatten into the sand. However, the wreck is still intact and mostly visible. And that is 3 stories of 3 lesser-known shipwrecks that have occurred on the Great Lakes, and with their brief stories made available. Well, guys, that concludes this episode and these 3 vessels that were a lot lesser known compared to some of the other vessels, well, a lot of the other vessels I cover on this channel. I've come across them a few times, like I was saying in the beginning of the video, and just due to a lack of information or newspaper articles or just, records being spotty at best, I've passed them up a few times. But this time I said, no, I can't keep passing them up because every crew member that was lost on these 3 vessels matters and counts and deserves to never be forgotten. And I hope that I have brought some honor and respect to these crewmen, whoever they are, and may these ships and their stories never be forgotten. And I hope my tiny video can help in part with that. But with that being said, everyone, I thank you so very much for joining me on this episode of Songs of the Great Lakes. I hope you enjoyed it, and do keep your eyes open for the next video in the future. Until next time, God bless you all.